So you can see this is my first attempt at making a VTOL VR map here, and I'm currently flying in formation with a AWAC and an aerial refueler going at Mach 1. These guys are nuts. And I'm at full afterburner and I'm just struggling to keep up with them. I think this map might still need some work here.
Landing gear.
Hey everybody, welcome on board the A-26. Today we're just going to be looking at the angle of attack indexer and how it ties into the head-up display, speed indicator, and then we'll also look at how the indexer responds to various inputs and aircraft configurations. So firstly, just to define what angle of attack is, so it's not a combat term, it's referring to the aerodynamics of the wing and the airfoil shape. So it's the angle between the chord line on the wing and the relative airflow. So we're interested in the angle of attack because we want to fly the aircraft as slowly as possible, particularly for carrier landings when we're approaching to land. So the angle of attack, once it gets too high, too large, the wing will stall. So what we want to do for approach and landing is get the aircraft as slow as possible without actually stalling. So this is where the angle of attack gauge is really handy for us. Typically for approach and landing speeds, mainly in small aircraft and more basic training aircraft, the speeds that you'll use on approach and landing and for different aircraft configurations will be primarily centered on an airspeed. However, this only really works for light aircraft with low wing loading, low variation in its weight, it doesn't really carry much payload, and it's just a lot simpler for students to learn to fly just based purely around airspeeds. But this method doesn't really work well for aircraft with a high wing loading, swept wings, the aerodynamic shape of the wing, and aircraft with a large variation in its weights and payloads, etc. So this applies to obviously high performance jets like this, a fighter jet, and also typical airliner passenger aircraft. You'll find that they won't really have a standard set of stalling speeds. They won't use angle of attack, but they will have what's called a reference speed, which will change throughout the flight as fuel gets consumed and the aircraft weight changes, and also the payload that they have on board and the weight and balance, etc. And with that reference speed called VREF, the aircraft will continuously update the airspeed indicators colour bands, just to highlight to the pilot the stalling speeds, maximum speeds for their current configuration, etc. But we don't have those luxuries on this aircraft instrument panel, so we're just relying on the indexer to establish our best approach speed. Notice that there aren't any coloured speed bands on the speed indicator. It just goes from 0 to 800. Now let's have a look at the actual indexer instrument. First thing to note is that it only works with the gear down. So once the landing gear is down, you'll notice that the indexer now provides some indications. And this information is also duplicated into your head-up display over here, and it just sits next to the velocity vector here. So for the rest of the video, I'll just reference the physical angle of attack indexer over here. I might also call it a angle of attack gauge, my apologies. So in its simplest terms, the angle of attack gauge will give you indications based on angle of attack, or alpha, of about 8 degrees. Now you can see the alpha readout in the head-up display as well on the left-hand side. So the angle of attack gauge, when it's at 8 degrees of angle of attack, it will show the yellow circle in the center of the gauge. And if your angle of attack is above 8 degrees, it'll indicate that you need to reduce your angle of attack by the green arrow at the top of the angle of attack gauge. And if your angle of attack is below 8 degrees, it'll say that you need to increase your angle of attack with the red arrow at the bottom of the gauge. So once we have the angle of attack gauge stabilized in the center in the yellow circle, we know that the aircraft is flying at the lowest speed that's safe for your approach and landing, and it's got a sufficient margin above the stall speed for you to maneuver. Let's have a look at the effect that changes in airspeed have on the angle of attack indicator. So firstly we'll lower the landing gear to bring up the angle of attack gauge. Okay, at the moment it's telling us that we need to increase our angle of attack. So to do that in straight and level flight, we need to reduce our airspeed. That'll slowly bring the nose up onto the horizon, increasing the angle of attack. Okay, once we have the fully yellow circle indication on the angle of attack gauge, it's telling us that we're at the correct airspeed. And if we continue to slow down even further, we'll see that the angle of attack gauge will tell us to reduce our angle of attack. So counterintuitive from an airspeed sense, the angle of attack gauge currently telling us to reduce our angle of attack, but to remedy that situation we need to increase our airspeed. So let's bring it back up to on speed here. Give it some afterburner here. Speed it up. And coming back to on speed, and we're on speed there. Okay, so the next thing we'll have a look at is the effect that weight has on the angle of attack. So at the moment the aircraft's as fully loaded as I could get it. We've used up a little bit of fuel here, but we're as fully loaded as I could get the aircraft with weapons and fuel and external tanks, etc. So what we'll do is in just a second here, we'll jettison all of the weight that we can from the aircraft, and note that at the moment we are currently at the correct angle of attack for this airspeed. So what should happen is that when the aircraft weight rapidly reduces, the aircraft will pitch the nose down to maintain the altitude that we're currently at, and that will reduce the angle of attack significantly. And therefore this indicator here will tell us that we need to increase our angle of attack. So let's try that now. Okay, jettison. And at the moment it's telling us to increase our angle of attack. So let's do that now. So noting that we're at about 290 knots previously, let's see what performance increase that gives us for landing. And we're right about there, so 240 knots. That's made a substantial difference to the performance of the aircraft. Okay, so the next thing we'll look at is the configuration and the effect that that will have on the best angle of attack. So note at the moment we're at flaps 0. Let's move it up through the flap range to full flaps and see what that'll do for us. So flaps 1. Flaps 2. There we go, so it's telling us to again increase our angle of attack. So therefore we need to reduce our airspeed. And right about there, 210 knots. Excellent. Noting that we do have the conformal fuel tanks on it, we still have 13,000 pounds of fuel. So we'll dump a little bit of that later on when we go to land. We'll leave that there for now. Okay, so the next thing I want to look at, let's just bring the flaps up, increase the airspeed a little bit. We'll get a look at load factor and what that's going to do to the angle of attack. So the load factor is essentially better known as G on the aircraft, so we're currently sitting straight level flight at 1G at the moment. If we increase the G on the aircraft, that is essentially going to increase the weight of the aircraft and the requirement of the wings to generate more lift, and it will increase the angle of attack. So as the load factor increases, and then we're expecting that the aircraft is going to tell us to reduce our angle of attack with the down green arrow. And if we reduce G, it's going to tell us to increase our angle of attack. So let's look at that now. So we're starting off at the moment. You should be able to see in the HUD there, we're currently at 1G. And autopilot off.
Autopilot
So
disengaged.
we'll leave the speed there so we can manage the speed for us. We'll try and keep that consistent. So we'll increase G, we'll go up to 1.5 Gs. I'll just go directly upwards for now. There we go, it's telling us to 2.5 G, telling us to reduce our angle of attack. Now let's go to 0 G, and it should tell us to increase our angle of attack. And then at this airspeed, once we get back to straight level flight, we should go back to on airspeed. There we go. Okay, now one more point with load factor is that the load factor is obviously 1G in straight level flight. However, if we go to turn the aircraft and maintain level altitude, the load factor will increase. I'll demonstrate that now. So turn around to the right, will increase the load factor. We're going up to 1.5 G at the moment, and therefore that's telling us to reduce our angle of attack. Once we level out, it returns back to 1G. Note that the airspeed and altitude remain relatively constant throughout the turn, and we'll demonstrate that again. Turn around to the left, load factor will increase, angle of attack indicator will tell us to reduce our angle of attack. There we go, pretty stable 1.4 G there in the turn, and the whole way around at the same airspeed and altitude we were straight level. It's telling us to reduce our angle of attack. And we go to roll out, angle of attack indicator comes back to on speed. Usually on final approach to the aircraft carrier or to the runway, you'll be straight and level at 1G flying down a glide slope or whatever approach path you're taking. But something to note, if you're on a base turn or if you are manoeuvring to get the aircraft on centerline, you might see as you turn and your load factor goes up and down, the angle of attack indicator will oscillate in response to that. Okay, so the next thing we'll do is we'll clean up the aircraft, we'll dump some fuel.
Fuel done. Fuel done.
Here's my master caution. And we'll see how slowly we can fly down the glide slope without the use of the HUD, purely just using the angle of attack indicator to know that we're at a correct airspeed for approach. If there was a way that I could cover up the airspeed indicator, I would do that, but I can't, so we'll just ignore the airspeed indicator for now. So we've dumped most of our fuel. We'll return to Akatan, runway 02
Sierra
right,
1-1 tower, copy. Fly heading 074. Expect runway 02 right.
feet, set up an intercept heading for that finals track. And slow the aircraft down. Level of 2000. Configure nice and early so we can bring our angle of attack indicator up.
Landing gear.
Acknowledged. Okay, so at the moment it's telling us to increase our angle of attack, so we need to slow down, but we'll hold off on that for now. Still a while to go until we can get to the runway. CDIs alive. Intercepting finals. Maintaining 2,000 feet until we get the glide slope. Flaps full. Catch the balloon.
Sierra 1-1, tower, cleared to land at runway 02, right.
02 right land, Sierra 1-1. Okay, maintain this altitude until we get to the glide slope. Angle of attack indicator is telling us to increase, so we need to decrease our speed. Turn the HUD off. Start the descent onto the runway. Okay, still telling us to slow down. So we've got the throttle at idle, wait for that to catch up, increase our rate of descent for the glide slope here. Okay, we're coming to on speed there now. Okay, we're on speed. Okay, it takes to slow down. Okay, telling us to speed up, our angle of attack is getting too high. Too slow, increasing speed. There we go. Too slow, increasing speed. Ignore it now. Flare, idle, wait for touchdown.
Welcome back.
Locate next
Follow the
right.
taxi path to your parking area.
Sierra 1-1. Okay, and that is essentially it. So I guess the best way to memorize it, if you are going to use the angle of attack indicator routinely on carrier landings or runway landings, the best way is to say, okay, well, I'll do the opposite with my airspeed as it says on the indicator. So if it's pointing down, then we need to increase our airspeed. If it's pointing upwards, we need to decrease our airspeed. Oh my god, stop using afterburner, you're making this so hard. Guy's doing alright, but he's a computer as well. I can't keep up with this squidgy human brain. I don't know.